This is not a build I would recommend to anyone for so many reasons, but it's also the build I found myself most addicted to for the past week, and I had a lot of trouble putting down. This Autobomber is a Recoup based Archmage looper leveraging the 9 lives Forbidden Jewels, the new Graveyard modifiers giving 35% recoup to both life and mana, and a few final sources to hit 78% damage recouped as life, 100% damage recouped as mana, and 25% of damage recouped as energy shield. Now, why do I not recommend this build? Well, there's two primary reasons. Firstly, the 9 lives Forbidden Jewel set that drops only from Uber bosses for Witch is insanely scarce and consequently really expensive at times. I bought my pair for 60 divines, but I imagine it's much more expensive as soon as one single person buys a pair of jewels. Secondly, this build does require an initial ramp. Unlike War Loopers, a Recoup Looper can kill itself really easily in the first couple of seconds in a map unless you build a really big pool. I'm talking about 15k hybrid, something like that, and also with a lot of mitigation. Thus, it requires that I do a slow weapon swap ramp before really getting into things. It's only 1 or 2 seconds at this point in my character, but it's mandatory, and if I don't do it, I instantly die in game. Now, this allows your recoup when you do this ramp to reach a sufficient rate, and that will continue to scale for a couple more seconds after that, so you don't actually, Sudoku yourself in game. Now, this is a build that actually has a ton of defensive layers if you can get past the self-killing. It's suppression capped, it has a huge max hybrid pool, it's stun immune, ailment immune, and obviously features the absurd recovery of loopers combined with a completely passive playstyle, allowing you to move however you see fit. It's the kind of build that can face tank most mechanics inside of Uber bosses, but does struggle in a lot of T17s because of how many mods can potentially brick or just generally really screw over a looping build. Now then, why mana? Well, firstly, War Loopers do have to pay a really high skill cost in general. Using a gigantic 6k plus mana pool helps me bypass this as a part of theory crafting, and just makes everything much easier to do from my end. This is my first looper that I've ever constructed, I wanted to not have to worry too much about that. Secondly, Archmage is straight up one of the strongest ways to access flat damage currently. Mana stacking provides around 90% of the damage for this build. It also allows for a much bigger effective pool, meaning you can take bigger hits. This means that I can actually build more mitigation in general and also have a bigger pool for everything, but then I can also grab things like Chaos Res much more easily, have a scaled up Progenesis, or even get physical damage reduction depending on the size of the hybrid pool, because again I'm using a Forbidden Right self-hit trigger that does scale off my combined life and ES pool. Now, I'm not going to explain the generic mechanics of loopers in this video. Instead, I've linked a website with a ton of FAQ you can use to set loopers if that's something that's always interested you. Now, this build itself isn't super crazy. At the end of the day, it doesn't even hit like 20 million DPS probably effectively, and it's a build. Now, at the end of the day, there are much stronger loopers you can play. This build caps out at around 20 million DPS. I sacrificed a lot of the damage just to have slightly better defenses, and most other people I know tend to just go for like pushing 100, 200, 300 million DPS on a War Looper with a really great playstyle. I've also chosen to play Vortex Projection and Ice Nova or Frostbolts instead of going for the usual Ice Spear Dying Sun setup. I don't really know why I did this, I just didn't really feel like playing Ice Spear basically and really wanted to have Vortex of Projection, have nice AoE, play with a ton of different MTX and just have a good time in general. I'll go over the POB just so you can see some decisions, but again, this is not a build I'd recommend. I would not try to recreate this, I don't even know if it's efficient to do, but I had a ton of fun playing it. So one of the nice things about mana stacking builds is that it's built in sort of to have a really stretched out tree by default, because you want to start, in one of these two senses, but then path all the way over to the mana stuff. And because I'm stretching my tree really far, I'm able to get a lot of access to jewels sort of more naturally, and also go for things like suppression. So I think there's like a natural efficiency that can be found there. Unlike other mana builds though, I can't put the Unnatural Instinct on this side because this will give you a skill effect duration, which can screw up your loop, your Heartbound loop, your skeleton duration, all that sort of thing. Instead, I still put it on this side and pair it with a Parandus Pact, and I think this combination is obviously really, really strong. I think when I counted, it gave me 185 mana. That might be wrong, might be right, I don't know. It also gives you move speed, which is something the build really wants to have, although because of what I'm using, I'm not playing Annihilating Light, I can actually play for like Shield Charge if I wanted to, or run, I don't know, just some sort of more efficient movement skill. But I chose to use my sockets on other things like more utility and a bit more damage from getting an entirely second damage setup in my helmet. Other things to note on the build, I'm using a few Chaos Res tattoos. Pretty much just tattoo as much of your intelligence as you can, or at least I did, until my loop actually starts breaking from having too much Chaos Res. And this will be variable depending on what the stats are, how much mana I have, how much life I have, how much ES I have, all those things. I'm also classically playing the trader setup. Now, I didn't really think hard enough about this, but it is probably possible to drop the trader in this setup. You can also look to play Tides of Time potentially, and I chose not to do those things because I did want to hit the second breakpoint for cast damage taken, which is at 27% CDR, I believe. So I'm getting 5% from here, 20% from here, and then another 3% from a Abyssal Jewel. But yeah, I'm playing a trader setup. It's pretty classic. I do like it a lot because it lets you solve for two things. Firstly, permanent Progenesis, really big for a lot of builds. Now, it's not as insane for mitigation as it is on a lot of other places, but it does give you a lot of chaos res, and obviously Progenesis is still Progenesis. It's still probably the best flask in the game. Secondly, it allows you to get a lot of res. I'm super low on res on this character. I kind of need to be running this business. There is another option of going for a Tri-Ele Flask Shell, and possibly playing at lower CDR. And honestly, with a Tide setup, it's possible I could play like Progenesis, Tri-Ele Flask, and still have a Quicksilver, and be pretty tanky in that way. But I don't really think it's worth it. I didn't really want to try it too hard. Let's go to the Jewel setup now. So Watcher's Eye seems crazy. The damage recoup is really good to have. I chose to opt for bigger MOM, and the reason why this is really nice is not only because it allows for a bigger pool, but at my current MOM level, sometimes when I'm taking really massive physical hits, there's times when my loop actually stops before my character dies. And that can actually keep you alive, because the moment your loop stops, you'll heal back to full immediately and have the recovery kind of ticking for 2 or 3 more seconds pretty consistently. The Forbidden set I'm playing is 9 lives, and then I'm running 4 different 2 Dust Jewels. The website I linked has FAQs on how to hit the breakpoints, but basically this is mandatory to do if I want to play for my current setup as far as the loop goes. Prime aspects uncovered, I'm using Ancestral Vision to help me get to Elemental Ailment Avoidance cap. 50% off here, and then another 29% off boots, and then a prefix on my chest, which I used to previously have. But then I ended up buying this shield off trade, so then I have my last Elemental Avoided ailments off of here. Then an Unnatural Instinct recovered, Brutal, and then this thread. I actually really like this thread. And this jewel socket on the build is actually highly competitive. It's something that can fit Intuitive Leap, which allows you to grab these solo nodes really easily, and also grab this. It can play Unnatural Instinct, allowing you to get a little more recoup, and some of the small nodes here. But I do like this thread the most because Arcane Will is insane at 30% max, and then each of these nodes are like 10% more damage, I think, all averaged out, which is really crazy. And then Cruel Prep is just, good to have. It's not necessarily the best option, but I had a hard time finding something better than this. Gear-wise, it's pretty much just a mana-based build, actually. It's pretty much all mana life gear. And because I'm playing EO, there's not like a lot of crit stuff. Although I think the more I looked at this build, the more I was able to go for crit. Anyway, this is the Prophecy one, a Titanium Shield here. Helmet is a pseudo 7 link. It's actually really easy to buy templates of this thing off of trade because a lot of people are using this sort of setup on their Cock DD Inquisitors. Instead, I'm just doing this. This is just essence spam once you get a Conk Effect base with Hypothermia. Vault Regalia, this is a Gravecraft. Go on Craft of Exile, plug it in yourself. I think it's about a 1 in 8 chance to hit the double recoup without screwing things up too much. The ideal for this is to actually not have that regen life suffix because that's pretty much useless to have. There's a world in which you could just have the double recoup and then also have a usable suffix there. But I chose to go for this. You don't actually need much energy shield. Because the ES recoup rate is only 25%, I think I actually never get above 700 or 600 ES even, so anything around that number is more than enough and kind of is as high as you can get, really. Gloves are generic, leeching, res, suppression, pretty normal stuff. And then boots, the CDR boots that are necessary. Int is just nice to have because you more mana, more ES, so it's really cool. And then avoid ailments, this is often essence. Foible, sort of the early game best in slot for a lot of mana based builds, maybe late game best in slot, and then I'm running an unset because it's a fairly socket starved build. But the big mod that I want to have on here is Recoup. It's a pretty easy ring to get. I think I bought this for like 30 chaos, but there's a lot of options in terms of how you want to make a ring like this, whether it's rock, starting with a fracture. Yeah, probably just those 2 ways actually. And then finally a Heartbound Loop. This wants to be quality for that 420 fizz damaging a minion death. Belt of Recovered, strength, life, just like generic stats, so life, mana, ES, that sort of thing. But the most important thing is to have that cooldown recovery rate. The flash duration I think also actually helps out with my uptime. Technically, I'm not always at 100% uptime, and I can be because I have access to Careful Conservationist right here. But frankly, I don't really run out of Progenesis ever in maps to, because you know you're killing things, and 96% average is probably more than enough. Quicksilver runs out sometimes, but honestly, it's kind of whatever. That's pretty much the build. I'm like, had a really good time playing this thing. It's kind of a shame that it's so jank that you can kill yourself a lot. So it's probably the least hardcore viable build I've ever played. But it's sort of my initial foray into loopers, and it's an archetype I want to explore more and see how much further you can actually optimize to make a real build that isn't just based on like having an insane amount of damage. I know that people have been pushing that in terms of pushing world loopers, that frontier much further, but I think this sort of recoup based thing, especially with a graveyard mod, has a lot of potential this league, honestly.